MGM, Hollywood's Greatest Backlot, published by Santa Monica Press. Now, this is the sort of book that I just knew was either going to be absolutely fascinating or completely dull, and 3 cheers for these fine fellows, because this book is fantastic. So as you might have guessed, it is a book on the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer backlot. It just does such a phenomenal job on taking you on this tour of what a studio was like, and especially what a studio looked like during this period of the first half of the 20th century, when, during the studio system, when you had these studios that were quite literally filmmaking factories. I'm not particularly interested in the films from this period. I know there are a lot of people who are, but I really haven't seen that many like pre-1950s movies. However, I find this period of Hollywood and the conditions under which these films were made, the way they were made, is so fascinating. Such a romantic look back on, sort of golden age of the studio system, and indeed the filmmaking process, and sort of Hollywood glamour. And MGM is really the best studio you could make a book like this on, just because it was so well known as being like the most prestigious, the greatest of the film studios. So the direction they decided to take this book in is really, really intelligent, and I'll just read from the introduction, just so you get an idea of what that is. Our purpose in producing this book is not to discuss the films that MGM produced. That particular road has been well traveled elsewhere. Our interest here is not in the product at all, rather the factory responsible for the product. Our goal is to preserve in print and in memory, if not in brick and mortar, the actual physical place that was once Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer for the first time. In looking at Hollywood as a physical place, it soon becomes apparent that exploring the approximately 175 acres of real estate occupied by MGM for more than half a century is actually a poignant and apt microcosm for the entire studio system and for Hollywood itself. So just that part about, our interest here is not in the product, but rather the factory responsible for the product. That, to me, when I read that, I knew that I was in good hands with this book. Because like I said, I haven't seen really, except for Gone with the Wind and Wizard of Oz, I don't really know many MGM movies from this period that I've seen. So for them to focus on the productions, the movies, the actors, would have really alienated a lot of people, I think, where instead, like they have said, they're focusing on the actual place itself, the culture of MGM, and that is such a smart way to approach the material, and it just makes this book so accessible. So the book is divided into sections. There's actually it's surprisingly light on the actual history of the studio, but the first part is about the formation. Obviously, there are other books out there. I think one's called When the Lion Roars, which is an actual book on the history of MGM. So even though it passes by the formation of the studio, the rise of the studio, and then the decline of the studio in later years, it covers all of that pretty quickly, but I feel like it would really touched on everything you need to know in a really concise way. I never felt lost or bogged down or confused by anything. It was really great. And so the first section of the book is on the production facilities, the administrative buildings, production, film labs, costume department, music department, editing department, things like that. And so this section was definitely my favorite. Really does a great job of helping you understand what the culture was like, reflecting what it was like and what was needed to run these books. Because having said that, I do think the book isn't going to appeal to everybody. It's going to have a very sort of niche audience, people who are interested in this sort of stuff, in the same way that people who like cars like taking a look under the hood and seeing all the all the little nuts and bolts that make it run. That's what this book is like, but for a movie studio, and for someone who is really into that stuff, as I am, this is just such a wonderful resource. So since this book came out in, I think it must have been about 2009, there have been similar books on Paramount and Warner Brothers. There's one for 20th Century Fox coming up, but that's been delayed a couple of times. And I've had a look through those ones, and they didn't actually, not a comprehensive look, so I might be out of line in saying so, but I didn't actually think they looked or read as interesting as this one is. I think the authors really sort of knocked it out of the park with this one, and yeah, the other ones didn't seem to do, quite as good a job. Or maybe it's just that MGM is sort of like the archetype in the public imagination of what a film studio is meant to be. This prestigious, amazing land of imagination where films are made. And so perhaps it's just that, Paramount and Warner Brothers, stuff like that, didn't necessarily have as interesting or extravagant or showy history or look to them as MGM does. And speaking of, so as you've seen, the photos probably take up more than 50% of the book, and they're really, really great. I wasn't expecting so many sort of like behind-the-scenes photos, not just because they're not just behind-the-scenes photos of productions, they're behind-the-scenes photos, like someone in the payroll department or someone, working on a coat in the costume department, things that I wouldn't have thought they would have, bothered to waste film on back when the photo was taken. But it's so great to see them all here. The photos are just fantastic and really help bring it to life. The photo quality, likewise, is really, really good. Surprisingly so, again, considering the time in which the pictures were taken. It's just such great fun. And even though the book is quite thick, it's actually a very quick read because, like I said, the book is more than half photography, so there's not actually that much text. It's a pretty quick read, but the text that is there is fantastic, and they really don't leave anything out. They talk about like the barber shop and the newsstand and the payroll department and things like that, which you might think, who cares about that stuff? But it just really helps paint a complete picture. Really helps it feel like this is a fully functioning, self-sufficient factory. Like people could be born and live their whole lives in this studio, and actually some people almost did. And then on top of that, why I think this book is so fascinating is, say 70 years from now, I don't think you could really make this sort of book on studios today, just because nowadays film production is so fragmented and spread up and outsourced that it doesn't, that sort of self-contained workplace that I was talking about just doesn't really exist anymore. And because so much more of filmmaking is done, in a computer against a green screen on a sound stage with motion capture, there's not necessarily as much physical craft going on, not sets being built, stand there for 20, 30 years, and that doesn't happen anymore. So this is just a really great way of getting a glimpse of a way of filmmaking that was so glorious, and for better and for worse, certainly doesn't exist anymore at all. And the book just gives this really fantastic feeling of taking a tour, like a personal tour of these facilities during the time. Additionally, if you really like these sort of old-timey Hollywood photos, there's actually a series of books called Images of Early America, something like that, and they just do like old-timey pictures of American cities and landmarks and things like that. But they've actually got maybe like 5 or 6 books on like early Hollywood, Culver City, early Paramount. I think there's one on MGM, and they're much smaller than this book, but they're just sort of like photo books. And there are a lot of pictures in those that aren't in here, vice versa, and different information as well. It's a different experience, but still, this one's certainly better, but they're both, similar. They have similarities and differences, but you might be interested in checking those out. So then once we move on from the production facilities, you get to the second section, which is on like the sound stages and the actual constructed physical sets that were at MGM. Still really fascinating section. I just didn't like it as much because then they do sort of have to resort to talking a bit more about the actual movies that were filmed there, and understandably so, because what else do you talk about? But again, certainly never boring, even though I hadn't heard of nearly any of the films. And so the layout of the book is really nice too. It's very packed. There's, always, they've tried to cram as many images per page without sacrificing quality. And then the only thing I think it's really missing is at the start you might have seen there was a map of the whole lot with like each of the buildings labeled, and it would have been that's a really cool map, and it would have been really great to see a smaller version of that on each page with the building that they're or set that they're talking about highlighted, just because it can sometimes get a bit confusing on the descriptions when they're like, then southwest of the such and such building you get into the riding bungalows or something like that, and it's hard to sort of keep orientate everything in your mind, and I sort of had to kept flipping back to that map to try and figure out where everything was. But that's not a real major criticism in the scheme of things, just would have been something nice. But beyond that, just a brilliant book. So just to give you some sort of idea as to what the text is about, I'll read just one of the entries for one of the production buildings and then for one of the backlot sets. So I'll just choose one at random. So this is for New Film Lab Building. Across from these buildings to the west, see, that's sort of what I meant why the map would be helpful on the page, because it's hard to know just from that description. Anyway, across from these buildings to the west lies the Metrocolor building. This film processing plant rose from the site of one of the original glass stages in the 1930s and was long publicized as the largest laboratory erected inside a motion picture studio. It was in this lab that the studio, like others in the cost-conscious 1950s, began to process its own color film stock, known appropriately as Metrocolor. The process was cheaper than using Technicolor, then, as now, the industry standard, but as the years would prove, less durable. As internal production slowed in the 1960s, the laboratory began processing with great success for outside clients and other studios as well. The building, an upper floor which housed the studio gymnasium, was completely rebuilt as the Metrocolor building in 1979. At the time, it could boast of 4 25-seat screening rooms, a storage facility for 25 million feet of raw stock. These additions cost the company $1.5 million at a time it could ill afford it. The expansion included the removing of stages 16 and 17 to build Metrocolor offices and processing equipment. Yet the lab would be closed only 10 years later by Lorimar, which had purchased the lot, as part of the agreement with rival Technicolor. MGM publicist Doré Freeman, that guy's favorite story was the time he escorted Prince Grace and her 2 young children on a tour of the studio. The children were most fascinated by the barrels of 70mm and 35mm film found outside the Metrocolor lab. The princess and the children enjoyed rummaging through the barrels and took souvenirs of the snippets of films home with them. The little bastards, now we know where the missing reels for Revenge of the Cheerleaders went. And so this one's for the Church Alley set. Church Alley, as seen in Looking Forward and Kind Lady, include not only the front and side of a church, complete with a tree-lined rectory, park benches, and wrought iron fence, but also incorporated some dressable storefronts that stood adjacent to the chapel. Amusingly, the winning ticket cast one of these buildings memorably as Salome's Tonsorial Palace. Most of the sets were later moved or replaced by Church Street on Lot 2. And so you can see that sort of stuff on the sets is not necessarily as interesting, or at least not as interesting to me as the production facilities. But that's why it's great that the accompanying photos are really nice, because you get to see these really nice shots of the sets as they stood, because in photography and the movies is really the only place we can see them now, because they've all been destroyed. So I could not be happier with this book. A wonderful subject, handled and executed so well. Highly, highly recommended if you're interested in this sort of thing.